Well, another week, another fake media hype campaign. This time for Democrat VP candidate Tim Walz, seen here watching an Arby's burn down. The media's tried lots of angles. He'll bring in rural voters. He's a fashion icon. But there's something else going around, and it's much weirder. I'll read a few tweets and see if you notice a pattern. Tim Walz is the dad an entire generation wished they had instead of the one they lost to Fox News. I want Tim Walz to be my dad in real life. Tim Walz has been my replacement dad for a while. They also fantasize about Tim Walz doing certain kinds of things for them, like help them change a tire, teach them how to drive stick without making them cry. This guy fantasized about Daddy Walz beating up Trump with a baseball bat, who in this fantasy is also J.D. Vance's dad. These are the same people who were crying when Steve from Blue's Clues said he's sorry he left so suddenly.
I never forgot you. Ever.
And for a leftist, Tim Walz is an ideal dad. He agrees with you on every issue. He goes to church, but is one of those cool progressive ones. He'll let you go out and have some mostly peaceful fun with your friends. And the cherry on top, Trump hates him. As Jack Posobiec pointed out, they ran this exact same play with Hillary's VP pick, Tim Kaine, who, in case you don't remember, exists. So it has less to do with Tim Walz as a person and more to do with the Democrat voting base. There's some need there that they're grabbing onto. So what's going on here? Well, I sat down with Pastor Doug Wilson, author of Father Hunger, among many other books, to ask him just that question. Hope you enjoy. Pastor Wilson, thank you so much for sitting down with me.
Happy to do it.
So we tend to think of politics as this kind of rationalistic project where, or people tend to think that way, that there you have your issues and your positions on those.
Right.
And somebody may think that gun control lowers violent crime, and we can talk about those things.
They have positions.
Positions, yes.
Right.
And this Tim Walz is my dad thing seems to at least give us one of many windows.
It's a different set of issues.
Okay. Yeah. Issues.
There are issues,
right.
and then there are issues.
Right. So how in what way does this? What's going on with this Tim Walz thing?
So these people are emotionally unstable, and there's no explanation.
Okay.
Sorry for wasting your time.
Well, all right. Well, it's been a pleasure having you.
I jest. There is an explanation, and that is if you take a natural aspect of God's world and defy it or insult it or suppress it, hold it in abeyance, it will have its revenge. It will come back in pathological forms, right? And then when you point this out, people think that you're defending the pathological form. This occurs in multiple areas. For example, one time I wrote in defense of C.S. Lewis's argument that submission in marriage is an erotic necessity, right? So it's not just a good thing to do because the Bible says, but he said it's an erotic necessity, which he says in That Hideous Strength, and then another book also. And I repeated that argument one time, and a bunch of people went nuts.
Sure.
Because I argued that suppression of that natural headship and submission in marriage resulted in that impulse coming back in pathological forms, rape fantasies, 50 Shades of Grey stuff, right? So this pathological thing comes back. Well, it's the same thing here. And the pathological form is that Tim Walz is not their dad. He's their nanny dad.
Okay.
Yeah. Right? So someone, I forget who it was, compared in broad strokes the Democratic Party to an indulgent mother, and the Republicans as a stern father.
Sure.
Right. Now, there are all sorts of things. You can point to exceptions and problems, especially on the Republican side.
If only.
If only. But it's true to say that liberalism, collectivism is indulgent. And it's also true to say that true conservatism is stern, is like a Dutch uncle, is like it's more masculine, right. And if you're in revolt against that, and you suppress that impulse, and you have a bad relationship with your actual dad, you're fighting all the natural impulses. Then when someone comes along like Tim Walz, who looks like a dad, looks like a granddad, he can put on the folksy Midwestern. I'm the relative you run into at family reunions. It just opens the door for people to start fantasizing, but they want a dad who never says no to them.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is to say, they don't want a dad.
Sure.
What they want is a scratch and sniff dad, someone who looks like a dad or someone who plays a dad on TV,
Yeah.
which I guess is what Tim Walz is.
It's true. There's George Gilder talked about, I think he talked about the state with the black family being something like a stepdad. Or so breaking off and making sure that the family itself doesn't ever become a unit.
Yeah.
It doesn't ever form. And then filling that fatherly role in itself. In what way is... So there are personal failings, right? There are obviously ways in which some dads have failed in this way. But there's another angle on this that's the state trying actively to work against family formation and family coherence.
Right.
In what way do those interact?
So, in one sense, this is what happens when there's a natural abdication, right?
Right.
There's a natural abdication. Dad wasn't doing his job. Someone else steps in to take that position. Right. Then the second stage this is where it becomes serious, is where the nature of pouring a vacuum and the state steps in. Right. Well, it's not long before the state is actively elbowing its way in, fighting its way in. So it's one thing to have, to take Gilder's point, it's one thing to have a young teenage boy getting a girl pregnant in the inner city and then ditching her, running off. Right. And then some tender-hearted bureaucrat at Health and Welfare saying, "Oh no, what are we going to do?" Right. That's the first impulse. The second impulse is where the young man is, I need to marry this girl, and the state comes in and says, "Well, if you do," to the young lady, "you're going to forfeit all of these benefits." Right. So the state comes in to actively compete with the father, and they elbow him out of the way. Right. And then they've done that on a massive scale, thus discouraging family formation, thus discouraging any number, tens of thousands of people growing up without a dad, an actual dad, but with dad hunger, and forming a natural constituency of the Democratic Party. Right. And so, because that we'll take care of you, this is what we're used to, we'll take care of you. And people need to understand that that's the itch that's scratching is actually the maternal one.
Okay. In what way?
Well, the father is the one who brings home the bacon. Mom is the one in the traditional and now illegal way of thinking. Sure. Dad brings home the bacon, and mom makes it into comfort food that everybody sits around the table and enjoys it. Right. So what's happening is the state, this thing that they want Tim Walz to be, is the human face of the personal touch. Yeah. What they actually do is they get a check from some bureaucracy signed by some nameless functionary. Yeah. Right. But the human face on it is Tim Walz. Right. But that point of contact is really where is maternal. It's around the dinner table. Now, it doesn't mean that dads can't sit down at the dinner table, but in the now illegal way of thinking, the mom is the human touch. And dad is respected, honored, and it's not to say that the family doesn't have a close relationship with him, but he's more rhetorically distant than mom. Yeah. Right. Sure. And that's how it ought to be.
Right. The in Father Hunger and in your sermon series leading up to the book, you talk about the baptism of Jesus being this picture of fatherhood. Right. So there's a father who's present and makes himself known.
He's vocal. The father is present. He's there when Jesus is baptized. Right. He's vocal about his presence. Right. He owns his relationship with the Son. This is my beloved Son, with whom I'm well pleased. Yeah. And I argue that is the quintessential father-son moment in the Bible.
Right. And the pleasure in his Son, with whom I'm well pleased. It seems like that is the thing that a lot of these people who are tweeting something, they just want Tim Walz to be pleased with them.
Right.
In a lot of ways, they already are. He already is pleased with their views,
right?
But they also want them to teach him how to drive stick or something like that,
without crying.
Without crying. And yeah, it seems like there's a psychological need that these people have that they're trying to fulfill with somebody who's further away. Have you seen the warmth map of affection between conservatives, the difference between conservatives and liberals?
No.
Have you ever seen it? It's this circle graph, and we'll probably put it up, but it's two circles. One of them is showing the distance between a person and the people further away, and people's affections between conservatives and liberals. The warmth map of their affections, conservatives, it's much more close to home, and liberals, it's based on political beliefs. This survey are further away, which is intuitively
people
correct.
Who share my ideology.
Yes. Or are further away, or might be in a different country, and I'll send $10 to feed kids in Africa,
right?
And that's where the affection is.
If I could insert something here, there's a great book by Arthur Brooks called "Who Really Cares."
Okay.
Yeah. And it has to do with who really cares?
Yeah.
And he was something of a liberal who did this research, and it kind of messed with his categories. What he did is he went state by state analyzing donations, what people gave, not just to philanthropic organizations or food banks, but also blood donations and reading time at the kindergarten, and who really sacrifices to give, and then ranked them all by state. Right, and number one state, 3 guesses, is Mississippi.
Okay, all right. Yeah.
Mississippi was number one.
Oh, that's great.
And 49 and 50, I forget the order. 49 and 50 were Connecticut and Massachusetts.
Okay.
Right. So, and this reinforces your point, where the warmth graph is, the people in Massachusetts and Connecticut are deeply invested in being generous by some mechanism way over there. And the red state types are deeply invested in being generous to people you can see.
Right.
Yeah. And so, but at the same time, liberals, made in the image of God, as they are, can't maintain the distant bureaucratic machine is that's their temptation, that's their impulse, but it's not human. And what I said when you earlier about when you suppress something human, we need human contact. We need generosity to be actually between people. We need that, and if you suppress that by this mechanism of the bureaucratic state, that impulse is going to come back in pathological forms, in weird forms,
right?
Which we saw in your intro. We saw these weird. Right. I don't want to talk that way about it.
Somebody I've never met before.
And that's not to say that a king or a president can't be a father figure, because Scripture speaks of them in that way. Kings will be nursing fathers to the church, and so forth. But there's a way that where you honor the fact of it. Yeah, he is the father. George Washington is the father of our country. But when I speak about the founding fathers, I don't envision having grown up on John Adams' lap, having stories read to me.
Right.
And I don't envision Thomas Jefferson teaching me to drive a stick.
Sure.
I don't imagine that at all.
Yeah, right. I probably couldn't imagine that. But
neither could he.
Yeah. The idea of so it not being human, that people have affections that are further away from them, and discouraging affections close. It seems like it's not human to do that. It's not human to dishonor your father and mother in one sense, but it is tempting. It is sinful. There's a reason that God wrote that commandment.
You have to distinguish between creationally human and fallen human. So we are created in the image of God to function a certain way, but we've fallen into sin, so it's easy to not want to do it that way.
Right.
But when we veer into sin and we start writing checks on the basis of our sin, the checks have to be drawn from our created nature.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And that's where it's in our created nature that the checks start bouncing. Right.
Right. And so the media, at some level, the responsibility of the media to make somebody hate their dad, or the media coming in and saying your dad who loves Fox News, it shouldn't be. It shouldn't. You should basically cut him off, or he didn't get the vaccine, or whatever, that sort of thing. There is an impulse that they can grab onto, and what they're there to do is to encourage the worst impulses, these sinful impulses.
But when you do that, and you sort of disown your father, the father hunger does not disappear. You still have this created nature that needs a dad.
Right.
And you're going to start casting about for one.
Right. Well, and there's a reason I've seen probably too many documentaries about cults, and there's a reason that a lot of these cults are made up of people who grew up in bad homes, and that's again a pathological thing. But what they feel like when they get into these cults is, I can trust this person,
right? And
so when your trust has been abused in many ways, it's easier for that. It's easier for that trust to be abused again. For somebody to promise all the things that your actual dad didn't give you. You said that there is a healthy way in which to think about the rulers or the state as being, or the rulers as having some kind of fatherly role. How does that work in a healthy place? I've never seen that, where there's some kind of healthy relationship. If somebody says the president or a ruler or king is like a father, and if I had a good dad, and so I can imagine that, but that guy doesn't look like a good dad, and so how does that work?
So, I think when it's healthy, when America is a nation of 330 million people, so approximately 0.001% of them are going to meet the president, right? Everybody else knows him through the media, through reputation, and so forth. I would say the best way to tackle this is to go back to the law of God. If I say father and mother, what's my first duty? Well, my first duty is to honor father and mother. So if I want to understand the fatherly nature of a political leader, of a founder, I need to honor him, which is not the same thing as gushing over him like a needy bucket. And so all the clips you showed at the beginning were telegraphing or shouting their needy bucketness. Okay. Yeah. I'm an emotional sucking chest wound, and I'm going to glom onto this figure that looks dazzlingly nice.
And that I learned about 3 days ago.
Learned about 3 days ago. And that's not honor. When you honor your father, and you also do the same with your mother, despite the fact that mothers are closer and more nurturing, and fathers are more distant, austere, protective, and providing. There's not emotionally distant as in there's a problem, but more distant than mom. Right? Kids need, and this is the sort of thing that people could snip a clip out.
And give it to us, please.
And do bad things with it. But kids have an emotional need to be a little reserved around their dad.
And to not take chances.
To be careful, to be respectful of dad. Getting in trouble with dad is a bigger deal than getting in trouble with mom.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. Now, and sometimes that's a point of exasperation between mom and dad. But, I told them 13 times to do this, and you come in from the driveway and say, "Hey, put that away," and they hop to it. They hop to it. And mom says to dad, "It's just not fair, I tell you. Just because you're 8 inches taller and your voice is lower, why do they obey you? I'm the one who spanks them 90% of the time.
Right.
And you just come in and say,
Yeah. Quick reset. Yeah.
Quick reset. Well, yeah, it's not, if we calculate fairness that way, that's not fair. But we should learn from it that when we're seeking to honor our fathers and our mothers, we honor them according to their nature and according to the task that God has assigned to them. The fundamental task of husbands and fathers assigned in Genesis is to provide and protect. All right, to provide and protect. The fundamental duty of mothers is to nurture and comfort. And women are life givers and fathers are death dealers, but you want that pointed in the right direction. So so this is a good example of how everything's demented these days. If a fundamental duty of fathers is to protect, for example, and you look at the chaos on the southern border, and you look at how radically unsafe a lot of Americans feel because of these images of thousands of people pouring across the border.
Right.
That insecurity is deeply unsettling, even if you are on the Democrat side and in favor of open immigration. That doesn't keep the country from being unsettled.
Right.
So the political turbulence is as turbulent for the progressives as it is for the conservatives. Everything's
it's all happening to us.
Everything's all up in the air.
Right.
And what you're doing is, you mentioned the cult leader, who is the principal person the cult member needs to be protected from, and is the person they're resorting to be protected.
Right.
And that's the problem of the progressive left. They need to be protected. They're appealing to daddy to protect us. Right. But he's the one who's going to let them down in the worst possible way.
Yeah. I've seen pictures of Tim Walz. So he's a hunter. They've shown pictures of him hunting. And it occurs to me that when people see that, pictures of him with a gun, liberals see that and go, it's okay, he's my dad. He can have a gun. He's going to use it to protect me. Everything will be just fine.
Conservatives look at it and say, see, he just sees the last legal gun in America.
Right, exactly. I got it, it seems like this approach or this way of thinking about, when you see these stories of people jumping on and saying, Tim Walz is my dad, gives the lie to some kinds of liberalism or kinds of libertarian, sort of like a Rousseauian, I'm a isolated individual. And some people might fight back against calling Tim Walz your dad by saying, no, you're a grown up, you're an individual, you don't need anything like that. Can you talk a little bit about how liberalism and individualism is an insufficient way of addressing this need? So
are you talking about classical liberalism or progressive liberalism?
I'm thinking more of, I guess, like Lockean or like a
classical liberal,
classical liberalism, or maybe individualism or an individualistic kind of conservatism that's concerned with individual rights and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So, and this is a huge subject, but one of the differences between, I'll say, traditional conservatives who are very concerned about liberty and liberty issues, and libertarians who are concerned about liberty issues as a front burner issue, individual rights. Right. Is that libertarianism functions more like an ideology than an organic acceptance of how God made the world. Okay, because I would say to a libertarian, who says we need to keep the state out of the realm of individual choices. Every individual has to be free to make their own choice. And I would say 9-year-olds.
Sure.
Well, libertarians act as though everybody is sort of dropped into the world 21 years old with a driver's license already.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But there are a whole host of things that that shaped me, and the decisions made that shaped me were not made by me at all.
Right.
Right. I had nothing to do with the home I was born into. And then once I was born into it, I had nothing to do with whether my folks moved to Bolivia or not.
Right.
I could have been raised as a Spanish-speaking kid. I could have been,
Right. You're going to be in the car seat wherever they go.
I'm in the car seat wherever they go.
Right.
And all over the country they could go, all over the world they could go. And they could join the Methodist Church, they could join the Baptist Church, they could go to a synagogue,
Right.
And that's sort of bequeathed to me without me being consulted.
Yeah.
All right. And so the libertarian ideology comes in at the last minute and says, okay, but what counts is that last 3%. You deciding what you're going to major in college, as though that's not determined by all that went before.
Right, yeah.
So here's another way of thinking of it. When the libertarian assumes the atomistic individual is the foundational building block of society, and we want to preserve liberties, I'd say, fine, I want to preserve liberties too, but I want to preserve the liberties of families,
right,
and of households. Now, there are households that just have one member in it, and I want to preserve the liberties of that household also. But I'm interested in the household more than the individual, because I've used this illustration many times, and I'm going to use it many more.
Please do.
I'm not sorry.
Yeah.
A strong society is a molecular society and is made up of complex molecules. The libertarian paradise is an atomistic society. And ironically, that's what the statists want also. Right?
Right.
So an atomistic society is like filling up a huge bag full of BBs, and it resembles a beanbag chair.
Right.
So you push in anywhere, it doesn't have any structural rigidity at all. And then the statists, the progressives, want to introduce free love, pornography, pot smoking into the picture, which is to grease the BBs. It pours oil over the BBs to keep them from adhering to one another.
Right.
In the Burkean conservative world, the BBs are meant to form into molecules. So instead of individual atoms, you have complex molecules called the Wilson clan that has joined itself to a church called Christ Church, which is another complex molecule, which is connected to this other complex molecule. And then when a culture grows up like that, you have a set of allegiances and loyalties, to use Burke's phrase, little platoons, that have enough structural rigidity to resist the encroachments of the state.
Yeah.
So circling back around to the topic we're addressing, it's not surprising to me that these greased BBs are calling Tim Walz dad.
Yeah.
Right. They are free-floating, disoriented, disconnected, and all of them were created in their creational nature. All of them were created to thrive in a molecule. And they're told by their education and by the books they read, no, don't join that molecule. That's oppressive.
Right.
If you marry that guy and have his children, he's going to be the dominant atom in the molecule, and you're going to lose your
choice.
Your choice in all of this.
Right.
And so you go floating off. Don't want the illustration to get away from us, but
the BB floats off.
A random electron.
Yeah, sure.
But you're out there still having those needs that you can't articulate, that you can't explain, and which have you by the throat.
Right.
And so then when someone avuncular looking, like Tim Walz, shows up, you just glom onto him.
Right. It's like we're sort of born as this little Velcro ball, but we're only one side of it. Yeah. And we've got to stick to something. And if we decide that, I think what's attractive to some people is that they get to choose Tim Walz.
Yeah.
Whereas they didn't choose their natural fathers. Yeah. Right.
That's right.
And it does pat on the back our liberal tendencies, or our tendencies to think that, it's all, any unchosen bond is inherently oppressive.
Correct. And that really is the prime dictum of the libertarian mindset, which is ultimately the statist mindset. Because if you have all these greased BBs, there's no way to resist the state. When the state comes in and says, okay, this is what we're going to do now. You signed up for it because Big Brother loves you. And it ends up with you doing what you're told because Big Brother is watching you.
Right.
Which has also come out in Tim Walz's pronouncements
about speech.
You have no right. You have no right to free speech when it comes to misinformation.
Yeah.
And I want to just tear my hair out. Well, then we just outlawed you,
right?
Because that's misinformation. What you just said is misinformation, according to me.
Right.
So what would I say that would be misinformation according to you?
Yeah.
If so, he is a totalitarian. I think it's. I forget which Horowitz it is, but he said inside every liberal is a totalitarian screaming to get out.
Okay,
and that's an example of it. You have no right to free speech if there's misinformation. Right. So, okay, we're going to have a department of misinformation with penalties. And,
The fatherlessness or the father hunger, it's certainly natural. I think we've established that. There seems to be, though, a difference between many of the reasons that some people's father hunger hasn't been fed, why they're father hungry, isn't their fault. So the way that they started out is not that way. Some of them, you can blame the state, you can blame the media, you can blame individual dads for
their
failures.
Father who ditched,
for their failures. What's the difference between the kind of person who had these things happen to them that weren't their fault, and then is not grasping? Is there a kind of person who can have been treated poorly and then not, when Tim Walz walks forward with a gun and a smile, glom onto it? What are the difference between those two people?
So the difference here, this is the difference. We're all connected. We live in a sinful world, and every person on the planet has been negatively affected by other people's sins. Just like other people have been negatively affected by mine. Right? This is a sinful world, and so consequently, when God's grace is poured out on an individual, one of the first lessons they come to is, I can't change all those people out there. The only thing I can do is repent of my little corner. I can. The sum total of sin in the world is something I can't do anything about, but I can diminish it by repenting of my contribution, and that's as far as I can reach, right? So somewhat, I forget who it was. Somebody wisely said that bitterness, and this would be bitterness against the dad who ditched, or the dad who wasn't there for me, or whatever. Bitterness against him. Well, this person said, bitterness is like eating a box of rat poison and then waiting for the rat to die. It just doesn't work.
Right.
And so I just finished Meg Basham's wonderful book, Shepherds for Sale, and she has a great portion on this in her conclusion about all the ways when she was away from the Lord, living in a way that didn't honor him. And she said she was wronged significantly in various ways by different people. But she said at the end of the day, there was this piece of it that was my sin. And I couldn't, she said, I couldn't do anything about the other people's.
Right.
I could only deal with mine and repent of mine.
Right.
And so let's say you have someone who grew up an orphan, or who grew up in a single with a single mother, and dad was long gone, and there's this ache that they feel that's not their fault. That's a wound, and if it's a father hunger wound, I would describe it as a primal wound. It's not just a wound,
right?
It's not a scratch. So the worst kinds of father hunger would be primal wounds. And the illustration I use in counseling is that when someone hurts you, when someone wounds you, that's on them, and you're not in sin for being wounded. But let's say you go down to the ER, someone you knifed in a mugging, and you go down to the ER, and there's a big gash in your arm, and they treat it, stitch it up, and give you ointment, and say, we want you to change the bandages every other day and put this ointment on. And let's say you ignore all of that. You don't do anything. You don't change the bandages. Well, the initial wound is the person who knifed you. But when you get gangrene and it spreads up your arm, and then one day your arm falls off, that's not on them. That started with them.
Right.
But the gangrene is bitterness. The wound is what the other person did. So if dad disappeared and you have this primal wound, your responsibility is not to make the wound go away, because you can't. It's there. But you can keep it clean and dressed. You can keep it from getting infected.
Right.
And you can keep your kids from having the same wound. Right. And if you don't do that, you're just going to do a rerun. It's going to be the same thing over again.
Right. Well, thank you so much for sitting down with me. Really enjoyed talking
Thank you.
about this.